Nevada, 1988. A state built on sand and secrets, where the desert wind carries stories across empty miles and small towns hold tight to their own. In the early hours of a February morning, in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, a young woman vanished from her home without a trace. Her name was Sherry Ann Duncan, 24 years old, mother of 2 small children, wife to a man who would become the center of one of Nevada's most haunting mysteries. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to be taken. Her car sat in the driveway, keys on the kitchen counter. Her purse remained on the bedroom dresser. But Sherry was gone, and the only person who claimed to have been home that night would spend the next 3 decades maintaining his innocence, while a community whispered and wondered. How does a woman disappear from her own bed in the middle of the night? And how does it take 30 years to find out what really happened? The town of Yerington sits in Lyon County, Nevada, roughly an hour southeast of Reno, cradled in the Mason Valley where the desert meets the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada. In 1988, it was a town of fewer than 3,000 souls, the kind of place where the copper mine provided most of the jobs and the local diner served as the unofficial town hall. Sagebrush stretched for miles in every direction. The wind came down from the mountains cold and constant, carrying the smell of dust and creosote. Main Street ran straight through the center of town, flanked by low brick buildings and hand-painted signs that had weathered decades of sun and snow. People left their doors unlocked. Children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on. Everyone attended the same churches, shopped at the same grocery store, knew each other's parents and grandparents. Sherry Ann Duncan had grown up not far from Yerington, in the nearby town of Silver Springs. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders, brown eyes that people remembered as kind, and a quick smile that made her popular in high school. Those who knew her described a woman who loved her children fiercely, who kept a tidy home, who volunteered at the elementary school, and rarely missed Sunday services at the Methodist Church on Mason Street. She had married Robert Duncan when she was 19, a union that produced 2 daughters, Angela, who was 5 years old in February of 1988, and little Sarah, just turning 3. Robert worked at the Anaconda copper mine, pulling shifts that rotated between days and nights, bringing home a paycheck that kept them comfortable by Yerington standards. They lived in a modest single-story ranch house on the north edge of town, pale yellow with white trim. A chain-link fence around a small yard, where the girls played on a swing set Robert had assembled the previous summer. February 14, 1988, fell on a Sunday, Valentine's Day. The morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of high-desert winter day where the sun burns bright but offers little warmth. Sherry rose early, as she always did, and made breakfast for the girls while Robert slept. He had worked the graveyard shift at the mine and had returned home around 7 in the morning, exhausted, his clothes dusty with ore residue. The girls ate pancakes shaped like hearts. Sherry had used red food coloring to tint the batter pink, a small festive touch that Angela would remember years later with piercing clarity. After breakfast, Sherry dressed the girls in matching sweaters and took them to church. Robert stayed home to sleep. The service at the Methodist Church began at 10. The congregation that morning numbered about 40 people, mostly families with young children and elderly couples who had attended for decades. The pastor, Reverend William Corrigan, delivered a sermon about love and sacrifice. Sherry sat in the third pew on the left side, Angela beside her and Sarah on her lap. Several parishioners would later recall seeing Sherry there, would remember her singing the hymns, would note that she seemed perfectly normal, happy even, showing no signs of distress or fear. After the service, she lingered in the fellowship hall for coffee and cookies, chatting with other mothers about ordinary things, upcoming school events, the weather, plans for the week ahead. She mentioned that Robert's birthday was coming up in March, that she was thinking about throwing him a surprise party. She left the church around 11:30, buckled the girls into the back seat of her sedan, and drove home. The afternoon passed quietly. Robert woke around 2 in the afternoon. Sherry made sandwiches for lunch. The girls played in their bedroom while Sherry folded laundry and Robert watched a basketball game on the television in the living room. Neighbors would later report that nothing seemed unusual. No raised voices. No cars coming or going at odd hours. Just another Sunday in a quiet house on a quiet street. Around 5, Sherry began preparing dinner. She made meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans from a can. The family ate together at the kitchen table, a small ritual they maintained most nights when Robert wasn't working. Angela would remember her father seeming tired, distant, eating quickly and excusing himself to watch more television. Sarah played with her food, building small mountains out of her potatoes. Evening settled over Yerington. The temperature dropped into the 20s. By 7, both girls were bathed and in their pajamas. Sherry read them a story, tucked them into their shared bedroom, kissed them goodnight. The house grew quiet. Robert said later that he and Sherry watched television together until around 10, then went to bed. He claimed they spoke briefly about ordinary matters before falling asleep. He would insist, repeatedly and with apparent conviction, that when he woke the next morning, Sherry was simply gone. February 15, 1988, Monday morning, 6:30. Robert Duncan said he woke to find Sherry's side of the bed empty, the sheets cool to the touch. He assumed at first that she had risen early, perhaps to start breakfast or to catch up on housework. He got up, pulled on his jeans and a flannel shirt, walked through the house calling her name. The kitchen was dark. The coffee pot sat cold and unused on the counter. The girls were still asleep in their room. He checked the bathroom, the laundry room, the garage. Her car remained in the driveway. He opened the front door and looked up and down the street. Nothing. No movement, no sign of her. He called her name louder, walked back through the house, opening closets, checking rooms he had already checked. A strange feeling must have been building in his chest by then, something between confusion and alarm. He went to the phone in the kitchen and dialed Sherry's mother, Barbara Mitchell, who lived 20 miles away in Silver Springs. Barbara answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Is Sherry there?" Robert asked. "What? No, why would she be here? She's not here, she's gone. Gone where? I don't know. She's just gone." Barbara said later that something in Robert's voice frightened her immediately, a flatness, an absence of panic that seemed wrong for a man whose wife had vanished. She told him to call the police. She said she would drive over right away. Robert hung up and dialed the Lyon County Sheriff's Office. It was 7:42 in the morning when the call came through. The dispatcher who took the report noted that the caller sounded calm, almost eerily so, reporting a missing person the way someone might report a lost dog. Deputy Thomas Ramirez arrived at the Duncan house at 8:15. He was a young officer, just 3 years on the force, earnest and thorough. He knocked on the front door. Robert answered immediately, as if he had been standing right there waiting. Deputy Ramirez stepped inside and began asking questions. Robert led him through the house, showing him each room, pointing out Sherry's purse on the dresser, her coat hanging in the closet, her shoes lined up by the door. Nothing appeared disturbed. No signs of struggle. The bed was made, covers pulled tight and smooth. The windows were locked from the inside. The back door was secured with a deadbolt that required a key from either side, and both keys hung on a hook in the kitchen. "When did you last see your wife?" Deputy Ramirez asked, his pen poised over his notepad. "Last night. We went to bed around 10. When I woke up this morning, she was gone. Did you hear anything during the night? Any sounds, anyone coming or going?" "No, nothing. I slept straight through. Did she seem upset yesterday? Any arguments, any indication she might want to leave? No, everything was normal. It was Valentine's Day. We had a nice day. Deputy Ramirez walked through the house again, this time more slowly, looking for details that might matter. The coffee pot was cold. The girls' cereal bowls from the previous morning still sat in the dish rack by the sink. The living room showed no signs of disturbance. He opened the front door and examined the lock. No scratches, no signs of forced entry. He walked around the perimeter of the house, checking windows, looking for footprints in the hard dirt of the yard. The ground was frozen solid from the overnight cold. No tracks, no evidence that anyone had approached or fled. By 9:30, more deputies had arrived. Barbara Mitchell pulled up in her old Chevrolet, tears streaming down her face, demanding to know where her daughter was. Robert stood in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, watching the officers search. Those who were there that morning would remember his demeanor as strangely composed, almost detached, as if he were observing something happening to someone else. Barbara went inside and gathered up the girls, took them back to her house in Silver Springs. Angela asked where her mother was. Barbara told her that Mommy had to go somewhere but would be back soon, a lie that tasted bitter even as she spoke it. The search began in earnest that afternoon. Sheriff Harold Pritchard organized a team of deputies and volunteers to comb the area around the Duncan house. They walked in grid patterns through the desert scrub, searching for any sign of Sherry, any clue that might explain her disappearance. The February wind bit at their faces. The sun climbed high and cold. They found nothing. No clothing, no tracks, no evidence that Sherry Duncan had ever left the house. By nightfall, the search expanded to include the entire town and the surrounding desert. Volunteers from Yerington and neighboring communities showed up with flashlights and thermoses of coffee. They searched until well past midnight, voices calling Sherry's name across the empty landscape, the sound swallowed by wind and distance. Part 2. The investigation. The first 72 hours after a disappearance are critical. Everyone in law enforcement knows this. After 3 days, the chances of finding a missing person alive drop precipitously. Sheriff Pritchard understood the stakes. By Tuesday morning, February 16th, he had called in assistance from the Nevada State Police and organized a massive search operation involving over 100 volunteers. They brought dogs trained in search and rescue, animals that could track a scent across miles of desert terrain. The dogs were given items from Sherry's closet, her pillowcase, a sweater she had worn recently. They cast about the yard, noses to the ground, tails wagging with purpose. Then they stopped, sat down, refused to follow any trail beyond the immediate perimeter of the house. The handlers tried multiple times, different dogs, different starting points. The result was always the same. The scent trail ended at the edge of the property, as if Sherry had simply evaporated. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Yerington might have been a small town, but it rallied around its own. The local Rotary Club organized search teams. The high school football team helped distribute flyers. Sherry's photograph appeared on utility poles and in store windows throughout Lyon County and beyond. The image showed her smiling, caught in a candid moment at a family barbecue the previous summer, sunlight in her dark hair, her expression open and trusting. Underneath in bold black letters, missing, Sherry Ann Duncan. Last seen February 15, 1988. Contact Lyon County Sheriff. The local newspaper, the Mason Valley News, ran the story on the front page. The headline read, "Local woman vanishes without trace." The article quoted Sheriff Pritchard saying that authorities were pursuing all leads and that anyone with information should come forward immediately. Television stations from Reno picked up the story. For a brief moment, Sherry Duncan's face appeared on evening news broadcasts across northern Nevada, her disappearance treated as a mystery that demanded solving. But even as the search continued, small inconsistencies began to emerge. Deputies conducting interviews noticed things that didn't quite align. Robert Duncan's timeline, when examined closely, contained gaps that were difficult to explain. He said he had gone to bed at 10 and slept through the night without waking. Yet neighbors reported hearing a vehicle start around 2 in the morning, an engine turning over in the cold, headlights briefly visible through curtains. When asked about this, Robert said he had no knowledge of it, suggested perhaps it was someone else's car, a visitor to a nearby house. But the neighbors were certain. The sound had come from the Duncan property. Deputies began to focus on Robert with increasing scrutiny. Detective James Holbrook from the Nevada State Police took over the investigation on Wednesday, 3 days after Sherry's disappearance. He was a veteran investigator, 20 years on the job, a man who had worked dozens of missing person cases and understood the statistics that most people preferred not to know. That the majority of women who vanish are harmed by someone they know, often someone they live with, someone they trust. He sat down with Robert Duncan for a formal interview at the sheriff's office, a small interrogation room with cinder block walls and a metal table bolted to the floor. "Walk me through Sunday night again," Detective Holbrook said, his voice calm and patient. "Every detail you can remember." Robert repeated his story. Dinner at 6, television afterward. Bed around 10, nothing unusual. He woke at 6:30 to find her gone. "Did you get up at any point during the night?" "No. I slept straight through." "You're certain about that?" "Yes." "What about your vehicle? Did you move your truck at all during the night?" "No. It stayed in the driveway." Detective Holbrook made notes, his pen scratching across the page. He asked about the state of Robert's marriage, whether there had been any recent tensions or arguments. Robert insisted everything was fine, that he and Sherry were happy, that there were no problems worth mentioning. But those who knew the couple told a different story. Friends of Sherry confided to investigators that the marriage had been strained for months. There had been arguments about money, about Robert's long hours at the mine, about his temper when he drank. One friend, Linda Morrison, told deputies that Sherry had mentioned feeling trapped, that she had considered leaving but worried about taking the girls away from their father. Physical evidence was scarce to the point of being non-existent. The house yielded nothing useful. No blood, no signs of violence, no indication that a crime had occurred within those walls. Forensic teams dusted for fingerprints and found only those belonging to family members. They examined the drains, looking for evidence that something had been cleaned up, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The bedsheets were clean, recently washed. The mattress showed no stains or irregularities. It was as if Sherry had been carefully erased from her own home. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about Robert's behavior. His calmness seemed unnatural. Most husbands whose wives disappear are frantic, desperate, unable to sleep or eat, consumed by worry and fear. Robert went back to work at the mine within a week. He took the girls to his mother's house and returned to his regular shift rotation, as if nothing had changed. When investigators came to ask more questions, he answered with the same flat affect, the same absence of emotion. Those who interviewed him noted that he rarely made eye contact, that his hands remained still in his lap, that he showed no signs of the agitation or distress one would expect from an innocent man in his position. On Friday, February 19th, 5 days after Sherry's disappearance, a search team made a discovery that briefly renewed hope. A woman's jacket was found in the desert approximately 15 miles west of Yerington, partially buried in sand near an old mining road. Barbara Mitchell was brought in to identify it. She turned the jacket over in her hands, examined the label, felt the fabric between her fingers. It was not Sherry's. The search continued, but the energy was beginning to flag. Volunteers were returning to their jobs, to their families, to their own lives. The desert was vast and unforgiving. Without a direction, without any evidence pointing to a specific location, the search felt increasingly futile. Detective Holbrook requested permission to search the Duncan house again, more thoroughly this time. Robert consented, signed the forms without hesitation. On February 22nd, a team of investigators spent an entire day going through the house room by room. They pulled up sections of carpet, looking for bloodstains that might have been cleaned. They examined the walls under ultraviolet light, searching for traces of biological material invisible to the naked eye. They checked the crawlspace beneath the house, the attic, the garage. They found nothing. Whoever had taken Sherry Duncan, if indeed she had been taken, had left no trace behind. The investigation began to slow. Leads dried up. Tips that came in through the hotline proved useless. Stories from people who thought they had seen Sherry at a gas station in Reno or a grocery store in Carson City. Sightings that always dissolved upon investigation into cases of mistaken identity. By March, the active search had wound down. Sheriff Pritchard held a press conference and announced that while the case remained open and active, there were no new developments to report. He asked anyone with information to please come forward. Behind him, taped to a bulletin board, Sherry's photograph stared out at the cameras, frozen in that moment of summer sunlight, forever smiling. Robert Duncan never publicly appealed for his wife's return. He gave no interviews, made no tearful pleas on television. His silence was noted by everyone. In a town like Yerington, people talked. Theories circulated in the aisles of the grocery store, over coffee at the diner, in hushed conversations after church services. Most people believed Robert was responsible, though no one could prove it. Some defended him, pointed out that being stoic didn't make someone guilty, that maybe he was just handling his grief privately. But the majority opinion leaned toward suspicion. He knew something. He had done something. The question was whether law enforcement could prove it. By summer, the case had gone cold. Detective Holbrook moved on to other investigations, though he kept the Duncan file on his desk, kept returning to it during quiet moments, kept believing that eventually the truth would surface. He had seen it before in cases like this. Secrets have a way of coming out. Someone always talks. Something always gives. It was just a matter of time. Part 3. The silence 18 months after Sherry Duncan vanished. Robert moved with the girls to Las Vegas, 300 miles south of Yerington, a city where no one knew his name or his history. He got a job working construction, found an apartment in a complex near the airport where the sound of jets overhead provided constant noise, constant distraction. Angela was 7 by then, Sarah 5. They attended a new school, made new friends, learned not to talk about their mother too much because it made their father's face go hard and closed. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt suspicion curl in your stomach like smoke, but lacked the evidence to prove your instincts right. The years that followed must have been torture for Barbara Mitchell. She had lost her daughter, and now she was losing her grandchildren too. Robert allowed visits, but they were supervised and brief, always with him present, always under his watchful eye. Barbara would drive down to Las Vegas once a month, would take the girls for ice cream or to a park, would ask them gentle questions about their life, their father. Whether they remembered anything about the night their mother disappeared. The girls had so little to tell. Angela remembered waking up that Monday morning and her mother being gone. Sarah, barely 3 at the time, had almost no memory of it at all. The psychological weight of living with unanswered questions is crushing. Barbara developed insomnia, would lie awake at night imagining what had happened to Sherry, where her body might be, whether she had suffered. She contacted psychics, consulted with private investigators when she could afford it, kept a box in her closet filled with newspaper clippings and police reports and photographs of her daughter. She never stopped believing that Robert was responsible. She told anyone who would listen. But without evidence, without a body, without a confession, there was nothing law enforcement could do. In Las Vegas, the girls grew up in a house where the past was never discussed. Robert remarried in 1992, a woman named Denise who worked as a waitress at a casino on the Strip. Denise was kind to Angela and Sarah, tried to be a mother to them, but the girls remained emotionally distant, guarded in ways that children shouldn't have to be. Angela in particular showed signs of deep trauma. She had nightmares regularly, would wake screaming about drowning, about being buried alive, about searching for someone she couldn't find. School counselors noted that she was withdrawn, that she had difficulty forming friendships, that she sometimes drew pictures of a woman lying on the ground with X's for eyes. Those drawings would matter later. At the time, they were filed away in school records, mentioned to Robert in parent-teacher conferences. Dismissed as the product of childhood imagination or the lingering effects of losing her mother at a young age. Robert always had an explanation, always deflected. The marriage to Denise lasted 4 years before falling apart. She would later tell friends that living with Robert was like living with a ghost, that he kept secrets he would never share, that there was a darkness in him she couldn't reach. They divorced in 1996. Robert kept the girls. Time passed. The case remained officially open but practically forgotten. Detective Holbrook retired in 1995. Sheriff Pritchard died of a heart attack in 1998. New officers took their places, men and women who had no personal connection to Sherry Duncan, who knew her only as a name in an old case file. The evidence boxes sat in storage, gathering dust. In Yerington, people still talked about it occasionally, especially long-time residents who remembered when it happened. But memory fades. New tragedies replace old ones. Life continues. Angela turned 18 in 2001. She graduated from high school and immediately left Las Vegas, moved to Northern California to attend community college, put as much distance as she could between herself and her father. Sarah followed 2 years later. The girls stayed in contact with each other but rarely spoke to Robert. Something had broken in those relationships, cracks that had formed early and widened with time. Barbara remained in Silver Springs, now elderly and in failing health, still hoping that someday she would learn what happened to her daughter. In 2005, Angela got married. She invited Sarah to the wedding but not her father. It was a small ceremony in Sacramento, just a few friends and Sarah as maid of honor. Afterward, at the reception, someone asked Angela about her family. She said her mother had passed away when she was young and that she wasn't close with her father. It was easier than telling the truth. The truth was too complicated, too painful, too wrapped up in suspicion and silence. For those who have lived through trauma and tried to build normal lives afterward, there is always that moment when the past resurfaces, when the thing you've been running from catches up. For Angela, that moment came in 2008, 20 years after her mother's disappearance. She was in therapy by then, working through the layers of grief and confusion that had accumulated over 2 decades. Her therapist suggested that she might find closure by speaking with investigators, by going on record with her memories and suspicions, by trying to help solve the mystery that had defined her childhood. Angela called the Lyon County Sheriff's Office in August of 2008. She told the deputy who answered that she had information about an old missing person case, that her mother was Sherry Duncan, that she believed her father had killed her. The deputy took her information and promised to pass it along to the detective unit. 3 weeks later, Angela received a call from Detective Sarah Chen, a young investigator who had recently joined the department and had taken an interest in cold cases. They talked for an hour on the phone. Angela shared memories she had kept buried for years, hearing her parents argue late at night in the weeks before her mother disappeared. Waking once to find her father standing in the hallway with a strange look on his face, the way he had acted afterward, calm and cold and unmoved. Detective Chen reopened the case file. She spent weeks reading through old reports, interviewing people who had been involved in the original investigation, trying to build a picture of what had happened in February of 1988. She contacted Barbara Mitchell, who was now 73 and living in a nursing home, her memory slipping but her conviction about Robert's guilt as strong as ever. She reached out to Denise, the ex-wife who shared stories about Robert's temper, his drinking, his tendency to shut down emotionally and become unreachable. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In March of 2010, a man named Gary Phillips walked into the Lyon County Sheriff's office and asked to speak with someone about the Sherry Duncan case. Gary had worked at the Anaconda mine with Robert in 1988. They had been friends, or at least friendly acquaintances, and they had occasionally gone out for drinks after shifts. Detective Chen sat down with Gary in an interview room and turned on a recorder. "What do you want to tell us?" she asked. Gary Phillips was 61 years old, retired from the mine, living now in Fernley. He had a lined face and calloused hands, and the nervous energy of a man unburdening himself of something heavy. "I should have come forward a long time ago," he said, "but I was scared, and I didn't know for sure, but I can't keep quiet anymore." "Go ahead," Detective Chen said. "A few weeks after Sherry disappeared, Robert and I were having drinks at the bar in Yerington. The Silver Dollar, it's not there anymore. We'd had a few too many, and Robert started talking. He said something that stuck with me all these years. He said, 'You ever wonder how much weight the desert can hide?' I laughed it off at the time, thought he was just being weird. But the way he said it, there was something in his voice." Detective Chen leaned forward. "Did he say anything else?" "Not directly. But later that night, when we were leaving, he looked at me and said, 'Sometimes people are better off forgotten.' I asked him what he meant. He just shook his head and walked to his truck. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't even close to proof, but it was something." Detective Chen added it to the file, added Gary Phillips to the list of witnesses who might testify if the case ever went to trial. She kept digging. The investigation had new momentum now, new energy. Technology had advanced considerably since 1988. Cold case units across the country were having success using new forensic techniques to solve old crimes. Detective Chen requested that all the physical evidence from the Duncan case be re-examined using modern methods. Part 4. The revelation. The breaking point came in the spring of 2017, 29 years after Sherry Duncan vanished. Sarah, now 32 years old and working as a nurse in Oregon, reached out to Detective Chen. She had been in therapy for several years, working through her own trauma, and had begun to recover memories that she wasn't sure were real or imagined. Memory is a strange and unreliable thing, especially memories from early childhood. But Sarah remembered something from that Monday morning, February 15th, 1988, something she had buried so deeply that it had taken decades to surface. She remembered waking up very early, while it was still dark. She remembered getting out of bed and walking to the doorway of her room, looking down the hallway toward her parents' bedroom. She remembered seeing her father carrying something wrapped in a blanket, moving quickly toward the garage. She remembered the sound of the garage door opening, then closing. She remembered climbing back into bed and falling asleep, and when she woke again, it was morning and her mother was gone. I don't know if what I remember is real, Sarah told Detective Chen over the phone, her voice shaking. I've been working with my therapist on this for months, but it won't leave me alone. I see it every time I close my eyes. Detective Chen listened. She had worked enough cases to know that recovered memories were controversial, that they could be unreliable, that defense attorneys would tear them apart in court. But Sarah's account aligned with other pieces of the puzzle. The neighbor who heard a vehicle start around 2 in the morning, the strange composure Robert had shown. The way the scent dogs had lost Sherry's trail at the edge of the property, as if she had been carried away rather than walking on her own. In June of 2017, Detective Chen presented the case to the Lyon County District Attorney. The DA was hesitant. 29 years had passed. The physical evidence was minimal. Much of the case rested on circumstantial evidence, witness statements, and the memories of a woman who had been 3 years old at the time. But there was enough. The DA authorized a warrant for Robert Duncan's arrest. On July 12, 2017, officers from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department went to Robert Duncan's apartment. He was 64 years old by then, gray-haired and stooped, working part-time as a security guard. He answered the door in his uniform, surprised to see police on his doorstep. They read him his rights and placed him under arrest for the murder of Sherry Ann Duncan. He said nothing as they handcuffed him, showed no emotion, maintained the same flat affect he had displayed 29 years earlier when his wife first disappeared. The arrest made headlines across Nevada. Local news stations ran stories with footage of Robert being led into the Lyon County Jail, his head down, his expression unreadable. The old photograph of Sherry appeared again, that same image from 1988, her smile frozen in time. The community reacted with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Finally, people said. Finally, someone is being held accountable, but there was no joy in it. Sherry was still gone. No arrest would bring her back. The preliminary hearing took place in September. The courtroom in Yerington was packed with spectators, media and family members. Barbara Mitchell, now 82 and in a wheelchair, sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on Robert Duncan. Angela and Sarah sat beside her, both crying quietly. Robert entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles. He looked older than his years, diminished somehow, the weight of 3 decades pressing down on him. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. Detective Chen testified about the timeline discrepancies, the neighbor's account of hearing a vehicle in the early morning hours, Robert's suspicious behavior in the day following Sherry's disappearance. Gary Phillips took the stand and repeated what Robert had said to him in the bar. "You ever wonder how much weight the desert can hide?" The defense objected, argued that the statement was too vague to be considered evidence of guilt. The judge allowed it to stand, then Sarah took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she described her recovered memory, the image of her father carrying something wrapped in a blanket through the dark house. "I was 3 years old," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I remember. I've tried not to remember, but I do. I saw him." The defense attorney cross-examined her aggressively, pointed out the unreliability of memories from such a young age, suggested that her recollections had been influenced by years of therapy and by the suspicion that had always surrounded her father. Sarah held firm. "I know what I saw," she said. Angela testified next. She spoke about the arguments she had overheard, the tension in the house, the way her father had seemed different after that night, withdrawn and cold in a way he hadn't been before. She described the nightmares she'd had for years, the drawings she'd made as a child, the feeling that something terrible had happened even though no one would tell her what. Robert Duncan's defense was simple. He maintained his innocence. He took the stand in his own defense, something his attorney had advised against, and repeated the same story he had told for 29 years. He said he had gone to bed with Sherry on Valentine's Day night, had woken to find her gone, had no idea what had happened to her. He said he loved his wife, would never have harmed her, that the accusations were based on nothing but speculation and the faulty memories of traumatized children. "Where is she then?" the prosecutor asked during cross-examination. "If you didn't harm her, where did she go?" "I don't know," Robert said. "I've asked myself that question every day for 29 years. Did you kill your wife, Mr. Duncan? No. Did you dispose of her body in the desert? No. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In November of 2017, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Robert Duncan showed no reaction as the verdict was read. He sat motionless, his hands clasped on the table in front of him, staring straight ahead. Barbara Mitchell sobbed. Angela and Sarah held each other. The judge scheduled sentencing for January. At sentencing, the judge spoke directly to Robert Duncan. "You have maintained your innocence throughout this process. You have shown no remorse, no willingness to help this family find closure. Sherry Duncan deserves to be laid to rest properly. Her family deserves to know where she is. Your refusal to provide that information, even now, speaks to the depth of your guilt." Robert was sentenced to 15 years to life. At his age, it was effectively a life sentence. He was transferred to a state prison in northern Nevada, a place not far from where he had lived when Sherry disappeared, where the desert stretched for miles in every direction, holding secrets beneath its sand and sage. To this day, Sherry Duncan's body has never been found. Law enforcement conducted extensive searches of the desert surrounding Yerington, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, focusing on areas Robert would have had access to in 1988. They found nothing. The desert is vast, and 3 decades is a long time for wind and weather to erase evidence, but the conviction stands. Robert Duncan was found guilty of murder, and he remains in prison. Closing the case of Sherry Duncan reminds us that truth, even when delayed by decades, has a way of emerging from silence. A young mother vanished on a February night in a small Nevada town, and for 29 years, her family lived with the terrible weight of not knowing, of suspecting but being unable to prove, of watching the person they believed responsible walk free. Technology changed, witnesses found courage, memories surfaced, and finally, imperfectly, justice was served. Sherry Ann Duncan has never been laid to rest in a marked grave, has never been given the funeral her family wanted to give her. But her name is no longer attached only to a mystery. It is attached to a conviction, to accountability, to the determination of daughters who refuse to let their mother be forgotten. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.